My name is Peter Du Pré, and it's a name that gets bandied around quite a bit. It's capital D, small u, capital P, small r-e, and pronounced Dupré and not Dupree. It's just a personal thing, but a lot of people use say Dupree, and that's not. It's Dupré with an accent on the E. So, and that's my name. You know, I'm 92. Yeah, I usually kid around when I say I'm 90. I would have been 93, but I was sick a year. You got to think about that one a little bit. My mom and dad were both in World War I. My dad was an Army infantryman, and my mother was a Royal Canadian Air Force nurse. And they both served in Europe, and they both they married after they got back from the war. But so we were from a military family, but we weren't military. Just by coincidence, we all wound up that way. Historically, I worked at Bausch and Lomb. When I was in my senior year of high school, the war was just starting. We weren't in it. We being the U.S. wasn't in it, but we were certainly preparing for it. And the one bomb in the middle of Pearl Harbor had been a storeroom for the Pacific's binoculars. And it went off, of course, and it blew up, and it didn't break the binoculars, but all the reserve binoculars for the Pacific Fleet, and almost all of them Bausch and Lomb glasses, were thrown out of kilter. The prisms were knocked out of line and so on. So you couldn't, you looked this way and this way, but they had to be realigned, and they were sent back to Bausch and Lomb. I was a senior in high school, and I was at Edison Tech and studying photography was my main course. And Bausch's called the high school and said, all of our binocular repair people have gone into service, but these things are coming back, and we have to put them back together again, and we literally need help. And this was in the middle of my senior year. Do you have anybody that's ready to graduate? Just not, it's killing time, but able to come out of there. If you can send us somebody that would help us, then we would hire that person as a full-time employee. And when graduation came time, you know, they'd go back in and go through all of that. And there were two of us that got picked to do that, and I was one of them, obviously. So I was out here. I was a senior in high school and working full time as a binocular repairman. And our job again was to just realign these things. And I had three younger brothers, all of them in service, and I'm the oldest one in the family. And parents were dead, and so I was the senior. I was the father in addition to being the oldest in the family. But all of my family was going in, and it was wartime, and it was Hitler time, and it was kill the son of a gun, and the mentality was you didn't want to stay out, you wanted to get in, particularly where I was. And I was responsible for my three younger brothers, and they're all going in, and here I am enjoying life as a full-time employee, getting a good salary, you know. So, but they kept when my number came up for the draft, Bausch said no, we can't spare him because he's a binocular repairman. Binoculars are a weapon of war, it's just like a gun is. Okay, so our job was to fix these binoculars. And at that point, when I got another deferment, I just looked around and I saw all I could see was my brothers, my kid brothers, all in there. And here I am enjoying a full-time job and the money that went with that as a kid. Now I'm talking about a 19, 20-year-old kid. And so I said, no, I've got to go where my brothers are. So I turned down the deferment, And so they took me into service, and they decided in the eminent wisdom of the Army that I was in fact a binocular repairman. So they decided I was going to be sent. I was at Fort Niagara, and I was supposed to be sent to Philadelphia, to the Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia, as a binocular repairman in service. And at that same time, the Army opened up down at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. They decided they were going to create another hospital unit because of the anticipated invasion of Europe, and it was going to have major casualties, so they needed more medical aid. So they decided to create a hospital, quite literally. So they did, and the hospital was the 114th General Hospital, and they set it up in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So I'm at Fort Niagara, ready to go to Pennsylvania as a repairman, and all of a sudden they said, no, clean out Fort Niagara, send everybody you've got, because we got to staff this hospital. So by just the accident of timing, I wound up going down to Fort Bragg, and the rest, as they say, is history. We became very highly trained medics, but I never did do any more stuff with binoculars after that. After that, it was people that we took care of. So anyway, that's a little more background, and as far as the job was concerned, and I stayed in that field in the hospital. We trained. I was a U.S. Army medic in World War II. I was stationed in England. The battles were going on just 26 miles away across the channel, and we got the guys right off the front. They were, if you think MASH kind of situation, they would be taken care of on the battlefield by a medic, taken back to a field station of some kind or another, and then they'd bring them over to us in England, and either by plane or boat. And basically our job was you took the bullets and we took them out. Our job was to try to get this guy and put it back together again as much as we could. So technically I was a hospital and surgical technician, able to work in both ends of the care. And I was over there for almost 2 years while the battles were all going on, and so we had a steady stream of patients that were coming in. And you could fill libraries with the stories of individual cases, of course, that came in. But that was pretty much it. And we, depending on the flow of battle, that's what our workload was based on. The Battle of the Bulge was, and you've heard the phrase, the Battle of the Bulge, and it was a turning point really of the war. And but the casualties and everything that went with that were terrifying, and both in number and in degree of injuries. But we put a lot of guys back together anyway, and that was basically our job. Some of it was this, and some of it was actual, repair, fix the broken arm or whatever. And the stories that can come out of that are infinite. Just what kind of a story would you like to hear? Degree of the injuries, or the numbers of them, or how did they reach us? And sometimes we'd get them in, and they would come in on a gurney, a large wheeled thing, and they'd still be in the battlefield clothes. If a guy had a broken leg, we would not to cut the leg off, but cut the pants off, or cut the leg of the pants off to be able to work on the injury. So we got them muddy and all back in those days. Seems like a long time ago, and it was. But so anyway, that's what I was in. I was technically a hospital and surgical technician. If you can think of a battle, and you've seen a million of them on the tube, and let's say the kid got shot, got his leg broken or something, the medic would come running in, and you've seen the pictures with the red stripe on their arm, trying to, and their job initially was to stop the bleeding if that was possible, render some kind of pain relief, but you had to be careful of that because you didn't know quite what was wrong with the guy, but stop the bleedings and just try to get him so that he could be taken from there to something more definitive like a hospital. And our job was just exactly that. We were a general hospital. We took care of whatever came through the door. We had quite a contingent of doctors, nurses. It was a regular hospital, actually, but extremely active. And it was astounding to us, however bad the injuries were, that the majority of those young guys only wanted to get back up with their boys. They didn't want to go ship back home or anything. You've seen things, oh good, I got wounded, now I can go back home. They didn't want to go back home. They wanted to go back with their buddies, their boys. And that was across the board. They were pretty much that way. And so our job was to accommodate them as much as possible. But it did not, and you started to say something about meeting with other soldiers. We never had that. Every once in a while we would get a prisoner in because they didn't look at a man with a broken leg, for example, and say, well, he's one of theirs, leave him there. They would take them and treat them. And I don't know whether you'd call it honor among thieves or whatever but so there were times when we had patients that were other countries. It was very extensive training. You didn't just become a hospital technician or a surgical technician. Our textbooks were basically New York State boards for nurses. Our exams were New York State boards for nurses that were used to test what we knew about what we were going to be doing. So we were really quite highly trained in terms of medicine. It was interesting for me because my sister was a nurse and my mother was a nurse also. My mom was a nurse in World War I, a Canadian Air Force nurse in World War I. So we had a medical background going in. Yeah, the one with the worst wounds that we got by far was a young guy that had been shot in the stomach and developed peritonitis. And everything inside of him was infected. And this isn't a pretty story, but those infections start from the inside and work out. And he had been shot somewhere along in his side, and that infection spread inside his body to the point that the only thing that was holding him together was about 7 inches of skin on the back by his backbone, because the infection came around this way, and just literally he was like this. He was opened up, and you could actually see down into his stomach, and it was clear. I don't mean you could say, oh boy, look down in the stomach, but he was literally opened up, all but 7 inches of skin holding him together, and if we moved him, if we just wanted to turn him over so he wouldn't get bed sores or stuff like that, we'd get about 6 or 8 guys, and almost on a precise thing, just move them a little bit more, because if we moved this way too fast or this way too fast, you would literally break them in two. And so we had to, I remember him at probably the worst injuries of any that we had. And we we had one guy that came in that we never could find out. I was in charge of the office. There was of the ward. We had 40 patients actually. Most of them orthopedic patients. And at the end, and if you know what I mean by a Quonset hut, Katie, you know that you're familiar with the like a part of a tube. Quonset hut was a fast building that could be set up, and they used him. Quonset was the guy that invented the process. But it was, if you can think of a hospital looking like this, and these are each of these little huts, and at the end of the ward, which was just a room with beds on either side, there was a single private room. And at one point we had, in the middle of the night, when they brought in somebody, and as I said, I was in charge of the ward, and I never even knew who the man was, but he was somebody big. We knew that because of the treatment that he was getting. And we all reasoned that he was probably somebody from Eisenhower's staff that had been wounded or injured in some way or other. And it was all very secretive. We never, as I said, never found out. And he was mysterious in the sense that, you know what I mean by a steamer trunk? The rounded, the big old luggage. Today they do it with a soft bag, you know. And every place that he went, there was a very heavily guarded steamer trunk that went with him, and we didn't know what was in it at all until it was Christmas. The first Christmas after he arrived as a patient, he called us into the room, us being the two guys that were working in the room actually, and he wanted to get cups. He wanted me to get, what did we have? We had about 20 beds in there, so he wanted to get about 20, 25 little cups. And he opened up, or he had us open up this steamer trunk, and what it was cognac that had been, they had been in a monastery or God knows what, some farmer's private source, but this was dusty old bottles of cognac, and what he wanted to do was have a Christmas toast, and he had us take just a little bit in these cups and take them around and give them to the guys, and then they raised a toast to the American soldiers or whoever it was at that time. But those are the two, two most interesting. And one guy that I never did see, except that I know he went in as a patient, and he had an amputation. He took one of his legs off, and I was standing outside the operating room door, and the nurse came over and handed me the leg that had just been taken off, and said that this, and he said, as a matter of fact, this boy was a Catholic, and so his leg has to be buried. Yeah, so that, and this, then imagine a nurse opening up a door and handing a leg to you. That was an interesting thing. But that was it. It was wartime, and that's what we were doing. If the leg had to be taken off because it couldn't be repaired, well, then we took it off. And you're seeing the results of that now with the roadside bombs and so on that are coming out of the battles over there. Horrifying things, actually. I think probably the day of the end of the war. I just celebrate. It's interesting. I haven't had that thrown at me since I was. This last trip that I just took was the celebration of the end of the war. Okay. Well, when it actually happened, that day, the day the Germans surrendered, I was on leave in England, and we were in the town of Portsmouth, England. And we being, there were three of us, three GIs that had some time off, and we were there just on leave for just a long weekend, as it translates into a long weekend. And but we were there in Portsmouth the day that the Germans surrendered, and Portsmouth went nuts. I mean, the town, the celebration, you can imagine, it was the end. They had been fighting for 6 years, the British. And all of a sudden their war was over with, okay? And I say their war because our war was still with Japan. And we knew that was coming up. So those of us who were GIs literally stepped back from all of the celebrations that were going on and watched England celebrate, knowing full well that tomorrow we're going to head out for the east, the Far East, and to fight Japan. They anticipated there were going to be 1 million casualties in the invasion of Japan. And if you're going to have those kind of numbers for casualties, you got to have medical training, medical care for them. So we were told the day after the Germans surrendered, they closed our hospital, no further admissions, and clean it out, and they had us literally evacuate everybody that was in there, tear it down, package it up, send it back to the States to get resupplied, and then we were supposed to go over to Japan. So that night, and this is getting back to specifically that night, those of us who were GIs in Portsmouth, England, watched the celebrations of the town. Their battle was over. 6 years of the being in the middle of the war. The rationing, we don't think of rationing here like it was in the war. But when you ration a half a piece of toast, that kind of thing, that's what they had lived on, or tried to at least for 6 solid years. We've never known war here on the homeland like this, but this was the homeland. So we couldn't celebrate. We watched them celebrate. We were happy for them, but in the back of our minds, it's our turn now. So we're going to go back. And so they literally shipped us back to, they closed the hospital, took the staff, sent them back to the States for 30 days. And we were supposed to reorganize at the end of the 30 days and then go to Japan. But the answer to your question is events. Those are the 2 events that I can think of very much. They're still sticking in there, and it was 72 years ago now. That was interesting. They dropped the bomb. And once they dropped the bomb, then all of a sudden, all right, what are we going to do with these guys? Well, first thing that happened was they called, I say us, most of our guys, we all went back to our houses or to homes, wherever, and so 30 days later, we were all supposed to get back together again. Well, the Army called each of us after the bomb was dropped and said, take another 30 days. Because they had to figure out now, what are we going to do with these guys? We weren't ready to be sent out, and we also were highly trained medical personnel. We were filling in as doctors and nurses, quite literally. And in wartime, you do things that you don't do in normal practice, and sometimes you just go ahead and do that because you know what to do, and I don't mean you illegally operated or anything like that, but they didn't want to lose us, and we still had time to put in for our service anyway, and so they said take another 60 days, and at the end of that time they got a hold of us, got a hold of me. We were scattered by this time all over the country, and I got a reassignment to go to Staten Island in New York, to a hospital train company that had just been, military company that had been just created to, if you can think, I said we emptied out all the hospitals of Europe. Okay, well, there was thousands of patients, obviously, and they all came back, almost all of them, on board ship, and I came back on the Queen Elizabeth, and it only took us 3.5 days for the Queen Elizabeth. When we went overseas in the first, I was on a fruit boat out of Argentina that they called the banana boat, literally, that its whole existence was to go down to the south, pick up a boatload of bananas and take them up to a fruit wharf in New York Harbor, and then turn around and go back and get some more, and that was their whole thing. but they took that ship and made a troop carrier out of it. So when we went over, we were part of a convoy of other ships, and it took us 13 and a half days to sail from the U.S. to Britain. On the way back, when the war was over and there were no subpacks and everything out there, it took us 3 days. So we went this way, or we went this way, and so we were home in a hurry. But anyway, we got back, and our job now was to meet the boats full of patients that were coming in, and treat them, check up, make sure the wounds were being treated, and so on. And then, if we could, take them to a hospital near their home, where they could recuperate, where the folks didn't have to go so far to come and spend time with the guys. So that was, well, that we just had to put in time then until we were discharged. But they weren't letting us out right away quick, because the doctors, physically, the doctors and the nurses all wanted to go back to their private practice. I went back to Bausch and Lomb, first of all, because my job was waiting for me. I went back and I stayed for a while, and I used to, I had decided that I didn't want to go back to working on binoculars. I wanted to, so I got into a program at Bausch's to be a draftsman, journeyman draftsman, go to school, learn how to, and so I went to, I mentioned RIT, I went to RIT, and I went 6 years, nights, 3 nights a week for 6 years, but at that time it wasn't even called RIT, it was Rochester Athenaeum and Mechanics Institute. So I'm an early graduate of RIT, but through that connection, I became a draftsman, and I was working at that at Bausch and Lomb, and I like to talk, and you found that out already in this short time, okay? And I would sit down to my drafting board, and it never said a word to me. It never. I had no communications with it. I would do things, you know, make my pretty lines and stuff like that, but no one ever talked back. No one ever said a word, and that was driving me nuts. And I just went to the boss and I said, sorry about that, but I gotta have a two-way communication, somehow. And they put me in the sales department of Bausch's, and my customers all of a sudden were the movie studios of Hollywood and so on, because Bausch's made professional movie lenses. And now, I don't mean that to be glamorous. I didn't meet or become anything to do with any of the actors, for example, except for one incident, and that's, I mentioned the Queen Elizabeth. When we came back on the Queen Elizabeth, they had that when we sailed out of, where was it, out of Liverpool, I think, they made an announcement that anybody that knew how to entertain to report, because they wanted to, for our journey back, they wanted to do something with the time, and so they decided to put a show together, and I played the harmonica all my life, and so I signed up, and so we put on a show, those of us who did any kind of entertainment, and we were on the stage of the Queen Elizabeth, and there were 21,000, and I'll repeat it, 21,000 soldiers on that Queen Elizabeth on the way back, and so, but we were 3 days, 3.5 days, and so this whole thing was to try to just fill that time, you know. And so we went in for the very first show, and the audience was we were in the grand ballroom with the Queen Elizabeth, which was a magnificent thing, obviously. And there were 2 chairs set up right in front of the stage. And when the show started, they brought in two people. One of them was a guy named Lehman, who was the governor of New York at that time, and the other one was Jimmy Stewart. okay? And so just, I was close to Jim Stewart as I was. So I said I never rubbed shoulders, that's not quite true, I almost did with Jim. I met him, you know, but in that capacity. And it was interesting because that one of the guys that had volunteered to help out on this thing claimed that he was a nightclub master of ceremonies in Chicago and had all kinds of experience. And he did, as it turned out. But all of his vocabulary had 4 letters in it, and he was just like early Eddie Murphy kind of thing. And he lasted 1 show, and they pulled him and then put me in as master of ceremonies, and so I entertained. That's the biggest show I ever put on. We had them come into the grand ballroom. 7 different shows we put on that day. Show lasted a little over an hour or whatever it was, and we'd clear out. They came in 3,000 at a time, empty them out one door, put them in on the other door, put on the show again, and for that one day we literally put on 7 shows. But it was in there. But then, and we met Jimmy Stewart along the way, you know. But that was, there's only so many people on the face of the earth can say what I just said, because that happened. That was very unusual, obviously, and fun too. Yeah, I play at every funeral at Assumption Church. I play here at the nursing home. I play, I'm involved with the honor flight also. I've been on the honor flight, but I've also, my job is to play when they come back, when they come off the plane coming back from Washington. I don't know if you've had the good fortune to be there at the airport. Right, okay, well, you know, the afterwards downstairs where they get everybody together in the one room? Mm-hmm. Okay, my job is to play at that, the music for that Star Spangled Banner, if you will, or whatever else they want played. And so, yes, that's the, here's my partial supply of my harmonicas sitting over here. But yes, I play all the time. And probably going to be making a recording. I've had some recording done, some CDs. Yeah, and so that's that answer. Yes, I do play, and I love it. I enjoy it very much. As a real little guy, my dad was in the tobacco business. We lived up in northern New York, and he was transferred down to a city called Bellevue, Pennsylvania. It's a suburb of Pittsburgh, and we moved into Assumption Church down there, and they had everybody. The church had its own school in those days, and there was a thing called the Harmonica Band. Now, we never had those up in the northern parts of the country, but back in those days, the band would be, the kids in the school would learn how to play the harmonica and play in parades and everything else. I mean, it was a big deal. They'd have a couple hundred kids in them, and people say today, no, you gotta be kidding me. But there weren't in it, we didn't have a lot of instruments around or anything, but they had harmonicas. And we were new kids in the block, and all the Du Prés were brand new to the family. I wanted to get to know who the other kids in the class were, and they all belonged to this band. And so it was the middle of the Depression. It was 1933, I think, somewhere around in there. And I wanted to be part of that band. I figured if I could do that, not because we were musical, because we weren't. In no way were we musical. And so my dad scared up 50 cents. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but 50 cents in 1933 was a lot of money to be spent on a harmonica, okay, when you could buy food with it. And so Dad bought me a Marine Band harmonica, just like that little white job there. And so I used to sit in the house and teach. I taught myself. I don't know music. I don't know a thing about music, but I know sound. I know how to make a pretty sound with it, and so I do, and I enjoy it very much. But I still do it quite a bit, actually. That's a good way to start. I don't want to get old. And that's not the right words. I don't mean it in that sense. I can't help but get old, you know. But my wife is gone, so it's just me and the 5 kids, and whatever is left of what I'm able to be part of, I want to do it, and that's why I jump at any chance that I have to play the harmonica. I mentioned the CDs. I did that as a fundraiser for our church, and they made over $1,000 selling CDs for the music department. Okay, and I mentioned that one of the highlights was just 2 weeks ago up at the Eagle's Nest in Hitler's home in Germany, you know, and I was up there playing God Bless America, and that's so that's quite a time span for you, but yeah, I just it's part of me. It really is. I carry it with me pretty much all the time, and I can entertain, and so I do. But part of it is, and well, I've had the phone rings all the time, and I say yes whenever I'm able to. And as a result of that, I have been able to travel twice over to those battlefields. I was over there in December, just before Christmas, for the 70th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, and again just a couple of weeks ago I was over in Austria and Germany for a couple of weeks to celebrate literally the end of the war, and that coincided with the reunification of the East and West of Germany. So just came back from being a part of those. And it's been a fascinating thing. So for me, World War II is still not going on, but the connections to it very much are. And so I've been enjoying that very much. It may sound funny, but those were days when I was a young guy, and they were fascinating things to be happening. It's still very big in terms of the people that we, being the Allied armies, freed, and they think of us over there in like Luxembourg and Belgium and surprisingly even in Germany as saviors. And I was up last week, 2 weeks ago now. We were visiting the Lion's Den, which was the Eagle's Den, Hitler's retreat on the top of the mountain. And you've seen, I don't know if you've seen any of the pictures, but meetings taking place on the big stone walkway around that home. It's up on the top of a mountain in Bavaria, and we were there, and I had we were there for a dinner actually, and when we came out, I looked around, and there were maybe 20 of us, all Americans, and then there were a lot of other people that were visiting there, and so I had my harmonica with me all the time, and I pulled that out and played God Bless America up in Hitler's den. You know, we thought it was pretty neat stuff. And that was just 2 weeks ago. exhilarating. It was I'll answer it from my standpoint, but also for what as late as recently as last night, I had that same question. I was out with a neighbor here, and we were at a church entertainment thing. I didn't play, but it's a nephew of mine out in Brockport, and the guy that I was with was on his honor flight a couple of months ago, because he had said to me one day, "No, I'm not eligible for that." I said, "Well, you were in service, weren't you?" And he said, "Yeah." And so bottom line is that question, by pure coincidence, we faced last night at a table in this church in Brockport, and he was saying, "Yeah," but and pointing to me, he got me to go, and what we're trying now desperately, when I say we, I work with the honor flight. That's one of the activities, if you will, and I play at the airport, but I also greet, just meet the people coming in the airport. There's 3 tables, 3 chairs set up there, and sometimes I'm on one of those chairs. I've had the pleasure of meeting with Maureen McGuire, for example, and all the various dignitaries, because there's 6 chairs set up in that room, and I'm in one of the chairs because I'm part of the welcome home entertainment. So I love to do it. I really do. I'm enough of a ham, but I also and I know I'm patting myself on the back, but I can play it pretty well. I like to listen to it myself, if you want. It was absolutely marvelous. I had a distinct disadvantage. We had the only one that was canceled in Washington. They closed Arlington. The weather was so bad. We had cold, wet, 30 degrees something, windy, miserable weather, and they quite literally closed Arlington by coincidence that same Sunday or day that we were there. We were 2 busloads of guys, and they took us to the cemetery. They took us to Arlington, and literally the gates were closed. There were no crowds or anything, and the only ones moving in Arlington that day were the soldiers that were on walking, the unknown soldiers. Okay, those guys were doing their thing, because that's 24 hours a day, come hell or high water, as far as the weather is concerned. But we enjoyed that nonetheless. But it was it was different, because we pulled up to the Marine, the raising of the flag, okay, and the bus driver just went over as close as he could to it by bus, and anybody who had a camera and wanted to get a picture of it. Now normally you want to go out and get the right angle and everything else. In this pouring, miserable rain, he just opened up the door, and those who had cameras went running out, got a quick picture, and came back in. But even under those circumstances, and that's the way we saw every one of the memorials, but it was awe-inspiring. It really was, and it had to have been part of that, Some of those names that were on the monuments, for example, were did I know them? Yeah, I knew them in the sense that they came through the hospital. My hospital, not necessarily, but the system, which I was part of, and so there's really no place. And one of the things you fight when you're talking to a guy that doesn't want to go on the flight. Because I never shot anybody. I never had a gun. I mean, this is what you hear, I didn't really do anything. But anybody that was wherever they were was there for a reason, and that reason was to help somebody that needed some kind of help, whatever it might have been. And your contribution doesn't have to be where you're face to face with the enemy. The contribution is to try to get the whole thing over with, and everybody contributes to that. And this little guy at this end of it, and that's the wrong word, he's not a little guy. he's equal to this guy up here who maybe was the general in charge, or that guy with the cognac, you know. They all contributed something. Well, even if it was sitting in an office and writing down the name. What name? The name of the kid that just came back. Why do you need the name? Because his parents live in Oklahoma, and we got to contact them. Is that an important thing? To who? To the parents? To the kid? Absolutely. To just say all I ever did was sit in an office. You fought your war. You fought your war a little differently. That's all. And I had that same thing when I was a medic. You know, I never carried a gun. One of my brothers was shot down over Berlin. He was a bombardier navigator, and he was a prisoner. That's my brother. Okay, my brother Paul was a Marine in the South Pacific, and he started at Guadalcanal and went all the way up to Japan. And now that's active boom, boom, boom warfare. Okay. In the meantime, I was this Army medic, and you tend to say, well, then what? I didn't shoot anybody. And one of the problems that we have, and now in the people that work on the honor flight or with the honor flight, is to convince that guy that just wrote out the names that was a contributor. 15 to 1. Each soldier shooting has on average 15 people in the system that had to be there for him to be able to do that. Where did he get his gun? Where did he train? Who trained him? Well, they trained him in such and such a place. Okay. And so, you know, to say if you were part of being in the military in wartime, you're contributing every bit as much as the guy that's shooting the enemy. And it's hard to get that through to guys. But one thing that's helping right now is that they're getting to the point age-wise that they're beginning to realize that, wait a minute, if I don't say something, the kids are always after me. You know, that we hear that a lot. Oh, my kids have always been telling me, you've got to do this, got to say that. Yes, you do, because once you're gone, there's an eyewitness. Once I'm gone, same thing. I walked around 2 weeks ago in Berlin, walking around. My brother was shot down over Berlin, parachuted down, and he broke his foot on a rock when he parachuted down. So he was in a German prison hospital in Brandenburg, which is this area around Berlin. And I literally 2 weeks ago was walking around, stopping and listening, and I'm saying, Dave, talk to me. Let me know, where did you land? Because I knew I was in the area where my brother had parachuted down. Okay. This is an appeal based on a guy that was there. Okay. Try to do this. Try to get this out. Try to tell the kids that you're with, whose grandfather is me. Okay. Tell them to get to Grandpa and tell him to get out and tell his story. Because once Grandpa's gone, there's no more story. And Grandpa was always going to, or should have. And if he doesn't, then that's all that history is lost. So I think it's important that everybody say, Grandpa, tell me. Because that's the other side of the coin. So the people, the guys are beginning to realize, when I say guys, it's mostly guys. I mentioned my mother, however, was in World War I.